Hi, everybody. You're reading with Jimmy. We're going to be analyzing Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Minister's Black Veil. Hopefully you read it with me. This is part one of two-part analysis. It's a very interesting story that Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote, published in 1836. And like all stories and novels and plays that we read, the first page, the first sentence, the first paragraph is very important in understanding and setting the tone so that we understand and appreciate the entire story. The first sentence, the sexton stood in the porch of Milford Meeting House, pulling busily at the bell rope. So what's a sexton? It's the person who looks after the church, acting as a bell ringer, formerly a gravedigger. So he's the guy that hung around the church and took care of it. So he's busily pulling on the bell rope. He's calling the people to service. That's what he's doing. The sexton, that's our first character. We don't know if it's a first or third person yet, but as we'll find out, this seems to be third person narration as we get into it, meaning that the narrator is outside the story talking to us. So therefore, if it's third-person narration, what we want to do, pardon the typo here, it's meaning, I can fix that. Let's fix that. We don't want anything bad happening here, so let's just fix that, right? Okay, there we go. The third-person narrator's outside the story, which means we have to believe him. If we don't believe him, this story will make no sense. So the narrator is telling us, as the people gather for the Sunday service, what's happening. All right, that we're going to find out that their parson is a little different. The title of the story, of course, is really the key: The Minister's Black Veil. You cannot assume that Hawthorne is the narrator. Remember, one of Jimmy's rules: do not assume that the author is the narrator, unless you can prove it. And in this case, it's a third-person narrator. So, Jimmy, doesn't that mean that it could be Nathaniel Hawthorne? Of course it could. But in all honesty, there's no way to prove that. So it's a third-person narrator. The old people of the village came stooping along the street. Notice the word stooping, right? That's a good word to choose for old people. They stoop. One of the things you're going to find out in this story is the rich vocabulary that the writer Hawthorne used to give the third-person narrator depth, perhaps. Is that a good word? To give you a feeling and to paint the picture. Remember, third-person narrators, like first-person, but third-person outside the story, are using words like a paint palette. They're drawing from the palette to paint the picture. So the children tripped merrily. Old people stooped. Their parents minded, a graver gait, mimicked the graver gait of their parents, pretending to be, old. You know how children are, right? Look sideways. Bachelors look spruce bachelors, spruce, buttoned up, right? They're looking sideways at pretty maidens. This doesn't look like a current scene, right? So if he wrote it in 1836, that's in the past. It's in Milford. There's a lot of Milfords in the country, but we don't know where just yet, right? Sidelong maidens, which Milford it is. So when the throng, it's a beautiful Sabbath Sunday, so it's Sunday, Sabbath, right? It's Sunday. When the throng had streamed into the porch, the sexton began to toll the bell. So he stops busily pulling it, and he tolls it, which means a steady ring. Tolling is ringing the bell at slow, measured paces. Why? Why does he do that? Because the throng had mostly streamed into the porch. And they're keeping their eye open for the Reverend Mr. Hooper's door, which is someplace near the church. Mr. Hooper, the Reverend Mr. Hooper. Now we know who the minister is. The first glimpse of the clergyman's figure was a signal that the bell can stop. So there's a ritual going on. They're ringing the bell, calling to people to service. "But what has good Parson Hooper got on his face?" cried the sexton in astonishment. So he sees that he's watching for the door so he can stop ringing the bell. And he says out loud, "What is this? What has the parson got on his face? He's got something on his face." And everyone within hearing distance turned around and beheld the semblance of Mr. Hooper pacing slowly his meditative way, which means he's always meditating. He meditates, right? Thinking toward the meeting house. Doesn't say church. It's a meeting house. It's a meeting house. May not be a Catholic church, may not be a Protestant church. It's a meeting house. So it's a different, we're going to find out it's probably a Puritan. All right, we'll talk about that. With one accord, with one thing, they started, they jumped, they're shocked, expressing wonder that if some strange minister were coming to dust the cushions of Mr. Hooper's plot. Some stranger's coming. They jumped. What's he got on his face? Goodman Carey says, "Are you sure it's our parson?" "Huh. Certainly it has to be Hooper," replied the sexton. "He was to have exchanged pulpits with Parson Shute of Westbury, but the Parson Shute sent an excuse yesterday, being to preach a funeral. So he couldn't make it. Parson Shute couldn't make it. It's going to change, but Shute couldn't do it." Now we find out, and this is going to solidify, the third person narrator is telling us this story. "The cause of so much amazement may appear sufficiently slight." I want you to think about that sentence for a moment. Who's saying that? It's no one in the story. It's not the parson. It's not the sexton. If it were the sexton, the beginning of the story would have read, "I was stood at the porch of Milford Meeting House busily pulling the bell rope." It would have said "I," but it doesn't. So the cause of so much amazement, what kind of amazement? Over the face of the preacher, Hooper, may appear sufficiently slight. Sounds like it's not a big deal, says the third person narrator. Mr. Hooper, a gentlemanly person of about 30, though still a bachelor, was dressed in due clerical neatness, as if a careful wife had starched his band and brushed the weekly dust from his Sunday garb. So he's dressed very well, but he's not married. There was only one remarkable in his appearance thing. Swathed about his forehead, hanging down over his face, so low as to be shaken by his breath, Hooper had on a black veil. And there, ladies and gentlemen, he's wearing a black veil, the minister's black veil. Within a couple of paragraphs, the title of the story is really revealed. The narrator is revealed. The initial reaction of the crowd is revealed. And the minister is wearing this black veil. It's got a black veil, which is strange. Would you agree? On a nearer view, it seemed to consist of 2 folds of crape, which entirely concealed his features except for the mouth and chin, but probably didn't intercept his sight further than to give a darkened aspect to all the living and inanimate things. So it's like wearing sunglasses. He could see out, but you can't see in, except for his mouth. With this gloomy shade, see, now the veil becomes a gloomy shade. Remember, I'm telling you, the narrator is painting with words. Good, Mr. Hooper. There's an adjective. Why didn't Jimmy mark that? Good. Can he mark that? Nope. Sorry. Good. Good, Mr. Hooper. Good, Mr. Hooper. He's the third person narrator saying this is a good guy, even though he's got a black veil on, right? Black. Mr. Hooper walked onward at a slow and quiet pace, stooping somewhat, and looking on the ground as is customary with abstracted men, yet nodding kindly to those of his parishioners who still waited on the meeting house steps. So he's walking, he's abstract, which means he's a thinker. He's stooping somewhat, not like an older guy. He's only, right? He's about 30. The narrator popped up back here again. He's a gentleman of about 30. You think the third person narrator knows his exact age? Of course he does. But he doesn't tell us his exact age. He says he's about 30. Remember, the third person narrator is telling us what he wants us to know, what we need to know about the story. If he wanted us to know Hooper's exact age, he would tell us that. But he doesn't think we need to know his exact age. He's around 30, right? He's slight, he's a bachelor, he's abstract, he thinks a lot, he's abstract. So the wonder, but so wonderstruck were they, the people, that his greeting hardly met with a return. So he's greeting and nodding kindly, but they're just struck with this veil. This veil stopped them in their tracks. They're not returning the nod. I can't really feel as if good Mr. Hooper's face was behind that piece of crepe, said the sexton. So they recognize, the narrator told us it's crepe. They recognize it as crepe. The sexton says, I can't really feel it's him, his face. I don't like it, muttered an old woman as she hobbled into the meeting house. Remember, she's old, she hobbles. He has changed himself into something awful only by hiding his face. Isn't that interesting? Do you remember masks in COVID, ladies and gentlemen? Do you remember masks? We're going to talk about this in the interpretation after the analysis. Jimmy has an interpretation for you. But do you remember when we were all forced to wear masks and how it was just before COVID? I thought only outlaws wore masks. They hid their face because they don't want to be recognized. And here we have a minister putting on a black veil and hiding his face. I don't think COVID's been around in the 1830s, right? So he's hiding his face. And the woman rightly says, it's bad. It's awful. Goodman Gary says, our parson has gone mad. Following him across the threshold. Following Hooper across the threshold. He says, I think our parson's gone mad. Well, would you follow a madman into the meeting house if you thought he was going mad? A rumor of some unaccountable phenomena had preceded Hooper into the meeting house and set all the congregation astir. So apparently, you know how rumors start and they break into the meeting house. Something's going on. Hooper lost his head. It's a headless horseman. I'm kidding. So they start, everybody's, right? They're mumbling. Few could refrain from twisting their heads toward the door, which means they're not supposed to look at the door. They're supposed to keep their eyes front, right? Where he's going to end up preaching to them. But only a few could really refrain from doing that. Many stood toward directly, and little boys clambered up on the seats and down again with terrible racket. There's a lot of commotion going on. There was a gentle bustle, a rustling of women's gowns, shuffling of men's feet, greatly at variance with the hushed repose. Remember, a meeting house, hushed repose, quiet. It's church-like, right? Which should have attended the entrance of the minister, but Hooper appeared not to notice the perturbation of his people. He entered with an almost noiseless step, bent his head mildly to the pews on each side, so he's bowing to them as he passes. And as he passed the oldest parishioner, who was a white-haired great-grandshire, who occupied an armchair in the center of the aisle. It was strange to observe how slowly this venerable man became conscious of something singular in the appearance of his pastor. So the old guy in the chair doesn't really notice anything until he passes, and then it kind of creeps up on him that Something's different about this guy. He seemed not to fully partake, right, of the prevailing, let's go to the next page, wonder till Hooper had ascended the stairs and showed himself in the pulpit face to face with his congregation, except for the black veil. So remember, he's causing quite a stir. He ascends the stairs to the pulpit, turns around, and he's face to face with them, except for the black veil, which means, ladies and gentlemen, he's not face to face. The veil is there in front of his face, and they're looking at the veil, not his face. I'm not saying that the third person narrator should have said veil to face. I'm not rewriting this story. But it's not face to face. It's veil to face, right? The mysterious emblem, see, it's not just a veil anymore, it's an emblem, was never once withdrawn. So he never moves it, he never takes it off. It shook with his measured breath as he gave out a psalm. So he's doing psalms, prayers, right? It threw its obscurity between him and the holy page. It was even between him and the holy page. What's that mean? The Bible, right? It through its obscurity. It's obscure. It's black. You can't see through it, right? He could see, but it's like watching through. As he read the scriptures while he prayed, the veil lay heavily on his uplifted countenance. So he puts his head up towards heaven and prays, and then the veil lays on his face. Did he seek to hide it from the dread being, capital B, whom he was addressing? So that's the third person narrator asking us a question. Did he, Hooper, seek to hide it, his face, from the dread being, God, whom he, Hooper, was addressing? So he's asking us that. He's not saying that that's what he's doing. He's the third person narrator, and he's asking us a question. Does he answer his question? Aha! Did you read the story? Then you should know the answer. But note the significance of the veil. It comes between him, his flock, his God. It comes between. It's a veil, and he's put it on. No one else has put that veil on. He did it to himself, and he's separating himself from everyone else. This was the effect of a simple piece of crepe. Well, it may be a simple piece of crepe, a veil, but it's not so simple now once he puts it on his face, is it? More than one woman of delicate nerves was forced to leave the meeting house. Wow, they can't take it. These are very sensitive people, very sensitive times. If your minister, if your whatever church you belong to walked in covered with her face covered, whatever, what would you do? Well, the narrator is saying women of sensitive nerve had to leave. Perhaps the pale-faced congregation, pale-faced. So these are white, right, people? The pale-faced congregation was almost as fearful a sight to the minister as his black veil to them. This is the third-person narrator telling us, what's he telling us? Perhaps, you see how the third-person narrator paints? Perhaps, maybe, what do you think? Perhaps his congregation was as fearful to him as he was to them. I don't think so, because he's still doing what he does. He's still preaching. So this is the third-person narrator telling us this. Hooper had the reputation of being a good preacher, but not an energetic one. What does that mean? Well, he didn't scream from the pulpit. He strove to win. This is the narrator telling us this, so we have to believe it. He strove to win his people heavenward by mild, persuasive influences rather than to drive them with the thunders of the word. You know, you've seen movies, you may have attended services where there's calm preachers, and there's some people who bring, they're shouting, right? This Hooper was a calm guy. And, he was, I want to persuade you to believe. So the sermon which he now delivered was marked by the same characteristics of style that he's always done. But there was something either in the sentiment of the discourse, what he was talking about, or in the imagination of the auditors. Who's the auditors? What is an auditor? Well, I defined that over here. An auditor is a person who conducts an audit, or in this case, the listeners. The listeners, the people, his flock. Something in their imagination which made that sermon greatly the most powerful effort that they have ever heard from the pastor's lips. It's so interesting what people deliver when they listen to people, what they interpret from people, but he's been a mild-mannered pastor, but suddenly this sermon is the most powerful that they've ever heard from him, whether it was coming from their imagination or the sentiment itself. What was the sentiment itself? Well, it was tinged more darkly than usual with the gentle gloom of Mr. Hooper's temperament. So the narrator is telling us Mr. Hooper has a gentle gloom about him, his character. He's gloomy, but he's not really gloomy. There's a gentle gloomness. The subject had reference to secret sin. And herein, ladies and gentlemen, is why most interpretations, you'll find out when we get to the interpretation that Jimmy offers you, most people think that Hooper is carrying a secret sin. I want you to think about this throughout the analysis, because I don't believe it. But anyway, the subject of his sermon was secret sin and those sad mysteries which we hide from our nearest and dearest, and would fain conceal from our own consciousness, even forgetting that the omniscient God can detect them. So he's talking about secrets. Do we have secrets from each other? Of course. Do we keep secrets from each other? Of course. Should we keep secrets from each other? Of course. Well, maybe not, right? This is what we're going to talk about throughout this story, because that's the subject of his sermon. Secret sin, secrets, not just sin, but mysteries we hide from our nearest and dearest. There are all things, think about this for a moment. Is there stuff you don't want anybody to know about you? Think about this. I want you to think about this, because that's what this story is about. A subtle power was breathed into his words. Each member of the congregations, from the most innocent girl and the man hardened breast, felt that the preacher had crept, upon them behind the awful veil and discovered their hoarded inequity of deed and thought. So it's like he's peering into their souls. Just from what he's talking about, they feel like, oh my God, this guy knows. Many spread their clasped hands on their bosoms. There was nothing terrible in what he said. There was no violence. And yet, every tremor of his melancholy voice, the hearers quaked. They shook. An unsought pathos. What's pathos? The experienced misfortune, emotion, condition from the Greek, meaning experience. In English, pathos usually refers to the element in the experience in an artistic work that makes us feel compassion, pity, or sympathy. So the way it's used here, an unsought pathos, an unsought experience, an unsought emotion, sympathy, came hand in hand with the awe. They're awed, and yet they feel all these emotions. There's tons of emotions going through them as this guy talked. Wouldn't you like to talk like him? I certainly would. So sensible were the audience of some unwanted attribute in their minister that they longed for a breath of wind to blow aside that. Wish a wind would come and blow that veil. Just get it out of there, right? Blow the veil. Almost believing that the stranger's visage would be discovered. It can't be Hooper, though the form and gesture and voice were those of Hooper. Just please blow it across. Can't be him. At the close of the services, people hurried out. Indecorum, confusion, and not in keeping with taste and propriety. They hurried out. Gotta get out of here. Gotta get out of here. Confusion, eager to communicate their pent-up amazement and conscience of a lighter spirits the moment they lost sight of that black veil. Holy mackerel, just get out of here. I just got to get out of here. Some gathered in little circles, others with their mouths open. The reason I'm taking a little time going over these words, because this is very important to the whole tone of the story, right? They don't know what the heck's going on, but they're feeling it. They're feeling it, the power of this guy. And all he's got on is this black. Remember, the only thing that changed, his temperament didn't change, his character didn't change. He delivered the same sermon, even though some people said it could be their imagination or maybe the content of what he was talking about. But that veil changed everything. That one thing changed everything. Some went homeward, wrapped in silent meditation. Some talked loudly and profaned the Sabbath day with ostentatious laughter. Some mocked him. Some were mocking him. A few shook their sagacious heads, intimidating that they could penetrate the mystery, while one or two affirmed that there was no mystery at all, but Mr. Hooper's eyes were weakened by the midnight lamp as to require shade. He studies too much. And after a brief interval, here he comes, right, to the rear of the flock and turning his veiled head from one side to the other, to the hoary heads, the older people, to the middle-aged people, right, to the young people, right? And he blesses them, puts his hands on the children's heads. He does the same thing he does every Sabbath, every Sunday. Nods to them, prays with them. What's that, right? Strange and bewildered looks repaid him for his courtesy. So, looking at him like he's got leprosy. None, as on former occasions, aspired to the honor of walking by their pastor's side. They're avoiding him. Old Squire Saunders, because doubtless by an accidental lapse of memory, says the narrator, neglected to invite Hooper to his table where the good clergyman had been wont to bless the food almost every Sunday. So the third person narrator said old Squire Saunders forgot, maybe neglected, due to an accidental lapse of memory. Is that true? The third person narrator says it's true, so it must be true. But even if it's not true, maybe the third person narrator got his tongue in his cheek. But he forgets to ask him to dinner. So Hooper, he returned to the parsonage, and at the moment of closing the door, the parsonage is where he came from, now he's going back. The minute the door was observed to look back at the people, and a sad smile gleamed faintly from beneath the black veil. This smile is important to the story, because he's got that smile. Flickered around his mouth, glimmering as he disappeared. He's smiling at them. Or is he? Is he smiling at himself? Is he smiling at what happened because he put the veil on? What do you think? How strange, said the lady, that a simple black veil, such as any woman might wear on her bonnet, should become such a terrible thing on Mr. Hooper's face. Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? It's become a terrible thing, but it's just the veil. Or is it? Is it just the veil? Think about it. Something must surely be amiss with Mr. Hooper's intellects, observed her husband, the physician. So he's the doctor. He's the doctor in the village. Something's wrong with this guy. But the strangest part of the affair is the effect of this vagary even on sober-minded man like myself. So it's weird, but what's really weird, says the doctor, is the effect of this thing on people like me, like you. The black veil, though it covers only a pastor's face, throws an influence over his whole person. Remember that. It's just the veil, but it's throwing all sorts of doubt in the people's minds, and he says over his whole person, and makes him ghost-like from head to foot. Do you not feel it so? Don't you feel it? Truly I do, replied the lady, and I would not be alone with him for the world. Think about this. Oh, well, Jimmy, those were simpler times. That can't happen nowadays. That can't happen. I mean, that's just crazy. People don't feel like that. Really? Is that true? Think about that, what you're saying. Because what you're looking at is a routine that's broken, a broken routine. You change the pattern of the routine. And if you know what I'm talking about, for example, we all work, or we did work for COVID. When you would go, there was a different dress code, right? Different dress code. People used to dress up, and then dress codes became lax. If dress codes were lax, or what they call business casual, in an office, for example, and you walk in a suit, people will start talking. You don't have to wear a veil. You just have to wear a suit. You have to dress differently than what you've always dressed. You have to do something differently than what you've always done. And people, guaranteed, will start talking and making stuff up and saying, look at Jimmy. He's got a suit on. He must be interviewing. I'm just saying. So in this case, in these times, 1830s, right? It's causing fear in the audience, right? I wouldn't be alone for the world. I wonder he is not afraid to be alone with himself. This is one of the keys, ladies and gentlemen, to the story. The veil has separated Hooper from the people. Before the veil, he was with the people. Now he's not with the people. Men sometimes are so, says the husband, afraid to be with themselves. I don't think it's men. I think it's both men and women that sometimes are afraid to be with themselves. A very key point to understanding this entire story. The afternoon service, there's another service, was attended with similar circumstances. Okay, before I go there, let's look at some of these. The interpretation of what happened, Hooper's gentle gloomy. There's some definitions here. What's an emblem? That's what they changed the veil to. It's a device or symbolic object. See, the veil, from the time the third-person narrator starts talking, is metamorphosizing into a symbol. It's not just crepe. It's not just the veil. It's something more. And we have to figure out what that something more is. What is it? It's an emblem, right? He's using different words to describe it, but it's becoming a symbol. The narrator, did he seek to hide it from the dread being? We talked about that. Is he trying to hide himself from God? No, I don't think so. We covered all this. Okay, good. So the afternoon service, I'm not going to belabor it, but it's the same thing. At its conclusion, this is the afternoon service. And what's the afternoon service? It's actually a funeral of a young lady. Young lady passed away, and it's a funeral. At its conclusion, the bell tolled for the funeral of a young lady. The relatives and friends assembled, right? And more distant acquaintances stood at the door, blah, blah, blah. It was interrupted by the appearance of Hooper, who still covered with his black veil. It was now an appropriate emblem. Why? Because it's a funeral. She's passed away. It's a black veil. It's right. People wore black at funerals. The clergyman stepped into the room where the corpse was laid. They used to do that in the old days, right? Lay the corpse at home, etc. And he bent over the coffin to take a last farewell of his deceased parishioner. And as he stooped, the veil the veil hung straight down from his forehead, so that if her eyelids had not been closed forever, the maiden might have seen his face. Very important, right? Could Mr. Hooper be fearful of what her glance might be, that he hastily caught back the black veil? He leaned over to say goodbye. He realized the veil was revealing his face, and he caught it and put it back over his face. The third person narrator says, a person who watched the interview between the dead and the living sculpted not to affirm that at no instant when the clergyman's features were disclosed, the corpse had slightly shuddered. So someone watching, this is the third person narrator saying that someone watching, right, attested to that the instant that corpse shuddered, rustling the shroud and Muslim cap. You can look those words up and get an idea of these are probably Puritans, Amish people, though the countenance retained the composure of death. A superstitious old woman was the only witness of this prodigy. So a superstitious woman was the only one who saw this. And why? Well, the imagination is great, even nowadays, right? From the coffin, Hooper passed into the chamber of mourners and to the head of the staircase to make the funeral prayer. And it was a tender and heart-dissolving prayer, full of sorrow, embedded with celestial hopes, and the music of a faintly heavenly harp swept by the fingers of the dead seemed to faintly be heard among the saddest accents. So they're hearing some type of harp music. People trembled, though they but darkly understood him when he prayed that they and himself and all mortal race might be ready, as he trusted this young maiden had been, for the dreadful hour that should snatch the veil from their faces. So you can see he's using the veil as a symbol when he's talking about this. And he's telling the people, hopefully you're ready, like this lady's been ready, right? This young woman who passed away, for the dreadful hour when death should snatch the veil from her face. The bearers went heavily forth, their burden, and the mourners followed, saddening the street, right? Or saddening all the street with the dead before them and Hooper in the back. So they're walking the coffin away. Why do you look back? Said one to his partner. I had a fancy. I had a feeling. I had an idea that the minister and the maiden spirit were walking hand in hand. Again, what we're seeing here, right, is really people's imaginations really going very strongly. I had a feeling, I had a fancy that they were walking hand. And so had I at the same moment, said the other. And that night, the handsomest couple in Milford Village were to be joined in wedlock. So now you got a funeral, first you had a church service, then you got a funeral, now you got, right, a wedding. Placid cheerfulness, placid, right, calm, for such occasions. There was no, right, that's what the melancholy man, Mr. Hooper, had a placid cheerfulness. He wasn't melancholy for weddings. He had a placid cheerfulness. And the people liked that. There was no quality of his disposition which made him more beloved than this, that he could be cheerful. He's not just a minister that preaches brine and brimstone, right? The company at the wedding awaited his arrival, trusting that the strange awe that they had gathered would now be dispelled. They were thinking it's a wedding, that veil, that mask is not going to be there. But when he comes in, the first thing they really see is that horrible black veil. It's now not just a black veil, it's a horrible black veil, which had added a deeper gloom to the funeral and would portend nothing but evil to the wedding. This is not good. Portend. It's going to indicate a foreshadowing. It's an omen. Oh my God, the wedding is cursed. See? So people quivered it was remember the wedding. It's just strange, black crape, dim the lights, death-like paleness, whisper the maiden. It's so bad. The wedding, it's dismal. It's dismal, right? If ever another wedding were so dismal, it was the famous one that they tolled the wedding knell for. What is this one? You should look it up, and I'm going to tell you about it. It's basically a story about a wedding where an older couple got married. The woman was married twice before, and the old guy who loved the woman many years was finally marrying her. And I'm not going to tell you what happens, but it's just different. It's different. And by the way, Hawthorne wrote that story too. Well, Jimmy, doesn't that mean that he's the narrator of this story? No, it does not. This is the third person narrator this is what they call an allusion. It's a reference to something else that'll enhance your understanding of what's going on in this story. So Google it, look it up. Mr. Hooper raised a glass of wine to his lips, wishing happiness to the couple, right? At the instant, and he was looking at that instant when he toasted the couple, he caught a glimpse of his figure in the looking glass and the black veil in his own spirit in the horror which had overwhelmed the others, and his own frame shuddered. His lips grew white. He split the untasted wine on the carpet, and he rushed forth into the darkness. For the earth too had on her black veil. That's a beautiful sentence by the third person narrator. It's nighttime. He catches himself looking at himself in the mirror, sees himself with the veil, spills the wine, and runs out into the night. The next day, the whole village of Milford talked about little else, caused a commotion. It's kind of like a spike on social media, right? Oh, look at it, look at it. The mystery concealed behind is supplied a topic for discussion constantly. Good women, gossiping in open windows. It was the first item of news that the tavern keeper told his guests. Did you see the minister's black veil? He's wearing a black veil. Guy's nuts. Children babbled on their way to school. One imitative little imp covered his face with an old black handkerchief and frightened his playmates that the panic seized him, and he well nigh lost his wits by his own waggery. What's waggery? His mischievousness. He scared the poop out of himself. It was remarkable that all the busybodies and impertinent people in the parish, not one, very important, ladies and gentlemen, not one ventured to put the plain question to Hooper, why are you doing this? What are you doing this for? What does it mean? Not one of them would say it. Not one of them would ask it. Where's the courage? You remember High Noon? That great Gary Cooper movie where three guys are getting out of prison to kill him. And he goes around the town trying to get people to help him. The old sheriff tries to, but he's too old. And then nobody will help him. He's got to face these guys alone. Do not forsake me. It's a great movie. But not one of them will help Gary Cooper. Not one of these people is going to go up to Hooper and say, why are you doing this? Whenever there appeared the slightest call for such interference, he never lacked for advisors. Never. People were always trying to tell him what to do, how to do it, giving him advice that he didn't ask for. But now, none of them are asking him about the veil. If he erred at all, it was so a painful degree of self-distrust that even the mildest censure would lead him to consider an indifferent action as a crime. If I just don't do anything, right? We're going to stop here for part one of the analysis, and then we'll go to part two. Isn't this a marvelous story? Isn't it? I want to show you something about the bell tolls. You remember for the funeral, the bell tolling, it opens up with the bell tolling. For Whom the Bell Tolls is not only a famous poem by John Donne, it's the title of an Ernest Hemingway book, very excellent book. Jimmy will probably read it, For Whom the Bell Tolls. But I want to read you this poem. No man is an island, entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent. a part of the main, and if a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. As well as if a promontory were, as it were, as if a manor of thine own, or of thine friends were, each man's death diminishes me. For I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Don't ask who's the bell tolling for. It's tolling for you. We're all part of the same, we're all mankind. One man's death diminishes me. Every man, woman, don't forget this was written way before even this story was written. And they used to use man in the universal sense. Can we agree on that it's okay to use that? All men are created equal. Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah, it's in the universal sense. We're all part of humankind, right? So each man's death, every death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Don't ask who the bell's tolling for when you hear it for a funeral. It's tolling for you. I love John Donne. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is part 1 of the analysis of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Minister's Black Veil. Learn more by watching our video analysis, part 2. Then we're going to have an interpretation for you. Email me, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks so much for listening. See you soon.